When looking at the Depression in Britain, I think it's first very important to acknowledge that there were certain areas in Britain that were devastated by the Depression. There were other areas that actually prospered during the 1930s in Britain. The key areas that we're going to consider in the videos on this section that really struggled were South Wales, Clydeside, the northwest of England, the northeast of England, and Northern Ireland. These were the areas that were worst affected by unemployment in the 1930s. And in fact, I'm just going to very quickly write those areas down over here. So we've got South Wales, a lot of mining going on in South Wales, Clydeside. We've also got the northwest and the northeast. Northwest, northeast. We've then got Northern Ireland. These were the areas that were devastated by the effects of the Depression. Clydeside, we've obviously got a lot of shipbuilding. In other areas, we've got a lot of mining, iron and steel production, and textiles. For example, in the northwest, we've got a lot of the textile industry. These were all old industries. All the old industries in Britain were based in these key areas. And when we use the phrase old industry, we are usually discussing coal, shipbuilding, textiles, so that would include cotton, and as previously mentioned, iron and steel. These were the industries that Britain had really, I suppose, conquered the world with. If we think about the British Empire, these old industries are the ones that have really propped Britain up and separated it from the rest. Now, in 1929, we have the Wall Street crash in the United States. In October 1929, we have the Wall Street crash. One of the first things in the USA, one of the first things that the USA does is it asks for its loans back. It asks for its loans back from countries like Britain and also Germany. It asks for its loans paid back in full and quickly, because America knew that it was entering this period of depression. This was bad news, obviously, for Britain, and it was bad news for the old industries, because these old industries were already in decline. Even before the 1929 Wall Street crash. One of the big reasons why they were already in decline was the growth in competition. And the big competition had come really in the 1920s. Competition had come in the 1920s from countries like the USA and Japan, who had been able to produce things like coal, for example, at 65 pence a tonne in the United States versus production of coal in Britain at £1.56 a tonne. So you're almost paying £1 more for a tonne of coal buying out of the USA rather than buying out of Britain in the 1920s. So the cost of coal is a really good example of where even in the 1920s British industry is struggling and is in decline. Textiles is another one where they were facing competition from the USA and from Japan. In the 1920s as well, we also have international disarmament, where most countries, let's get rid of that, where most countries, national disarmament, where most countries had decided to disarm after World War One. This meant, of course, one of the big things it meant was reducing the size of navies, and that is really going to hit shipbuilding in Britain especially hard when countries are not building up their armed forces. because essentially they're tired in the 1920s after a 4-year war. So as a result of that, if you link the shipbuilding in with the Wall Street crash, it leads to a massive reduction in British shipbuilding, and Clydeside would be badly affected in particular by this. So 1933, for example, 1.4 million tons of shipping was produced by Britain. If you compare that to, sorry, that's 1930. If you compare that to 1933 in Britain, they're only producing 133,000 tons. So the amount of ships they're producing has gone down, and this in turn leads to massive unemployment. People being out of work in these areas. Loads of people losing their jobs, particularly in the northeast. Again, going back to this kind of the long-term decline in these old industries. In the 1920s, the British government didn't help because they had a policy of free trade. This meant that these British companies operating in these industries had to compete with other products and services being imported into Britain, and those companies didn't have to pay tariffs, which would have discouraged those companies from importing into Britain. When these companies wanted to export into other countries, they had those same tariffs in place. So British companies couldn't export, but equally, people buying stuff in Britain were tempted by USA and Japan because the prices were simply cheaper. So all of this increase in competition. Then we have the Wall Street crash, the USA asking for its loans back, and all of a sudden we have a huge unemployment problem. So by 1932, well, you can guess how many are unemployed, but it's going to be a big, big figure. We're talking 3 million people out of work. 3 million people out of work. And of course, the big majority of those were working in these key areas, and that's where the focus of the problems of unemployment is going to be. So for example, the Jarrow March, which we're going to look at later, happened in the northeast near Newcastle.